Hello and welcome, learners. Welcome to today's lesson. In today's class, you will learn about major centralized states in pre-colonial Nigeria. And under this topic, you will learn about the meaning of centralized states, the characteristics of centralized states, and lastly, we will talk about some examples of centralized states in pre-colonial Nigeria. So with your writing materials, let's go to class. So what are centralized states? These are states that are drawn towards a center or that are brought under the control of a central authority. Centralized states are states that is drawn toward a center or brought under the control of a central authority. Now, put differently, centralized states refers to states, kingdoms, and empire that were centralized with large geographical areas ruled by powerful traditional rulers and powerful armies that existed in pre-colonial Nigeria before the coming of the Europeans into the region of what we now know today as Nigeria. Now, next up, let us discuss the characteristics of centralized states. Number one, they had powerful traditional rulers. In a centralized state in pre-colonial Nigeria, they had powerful rulers. For example, the Oba of Benin, the Sultan of Sokoto, the emirs in northern Nigeria, and chiefs, and so on. The ruler directed the administration of the states, which were centralized around him and his chiefs. For example, like I said earlier, the Oba of Benin, the Alafin of Oyo, and so on and so forth. Another characteristic of a centralized state is they had large geographical areas. The sizes of centralized states were usually large in pre-colonial era. They covered an elaborate land areas, units, and vassal states. Going further, another characteristics of a centralized state is that in pre-colonial Nigeria they had capital cities. The pre-colonial centralized states that existed in Nigeria were administered from the capital cities, from where the king or the ruler directed the administration with his chiefs. For example, the Hausa states, they had their capital city at Sokoto and Gwandu. The Benin Empire also had a capital city at Benin City. Another characteristic of a centralized state is standing army. Centralized states in pre-colonial Nigeria had powerful armies under the control of a commander-in-chief or led personally by the ruler or the king and able-bodied citizens. The armies were used for defensive purposes, for expansion purposes, for slave trade, and for security assignments. For instance, the Eso of Oyo Empire. Another characteristic of a centralized state in pre-colonial Nigeria is advanced civilization. Centralized states commanded a highly advanced civilization with urbanized layouts, streets, local technology, sculptural and art work. For instance, bronze and blacksmiths, walled city, and major gateways into the capital city. Another characteristic of a centralized state is absolute monarchy. Centralized states, as defined earlier, I said that there were states that were administered by powerful traditional rulers. Now, in this case, centralized states in pre colonial Nigeria were administered by autocratic traditional rulers. That is, rulers that had their say as final. For instance, the emirs in northern Nigeria, the monarch determined whatsoever it is that will occur in the state or in the empire. The words of the king were laws. In centralized states, the monarch determined state policies and put in place the mechanisms for implementation. For example, control of trade routes and markets. Another characteristic of a centralized state is fusion of power or centralization of power. In centralized states, the powers of the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary were usually fused in centralized states. The emir or the oba had a court which was capable of handling all cases. The monarch could make laws, handle cases, and pass judgment in a centralized state. Examples of centralized states in pre-colonial Nigeria. We have the Hausa states, Kanem Borno state, the Nupe kingdom, Oyo empire, Igala, and Benin empire. With this, we have come to the end of today's lesson. But a quick recap of all what we've discussed today: we talked about centralized state, that is the meaning of centralized state. We've also discussed the characteristics of centralized states, and lastly, we've seen some examples of centralized states in pre-colonial Nigeria. Until we meet again in our next class, goodbye and stay safe.